All right, Glenn, tell us where Joseph is and where he's going.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I took notice as Chris was reading from today's epistle lesson from Romans. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. See if you can find any of this in our story of Joseph today. This morning would have been the perfect opportunity to deliver my pocket sermon. You know, the one that I've had on the shelf in the fellowship room, just in case one of our speakers would not be here on a Sunday morning. The one where all the preparation had already been completed. All that remained to be done was to deliver it. The easy way out, so to speak. And today, given John Yost, our scheduled speaker, is unable to be with us, we have just such a time as this. Spoiler alert, the pocket sermon is on the book of Esther. Wouldn't it have been appropriate to bring out that message today, if you get my pun? But you know what? I realized that I had been kind of lazy about getting another message about Joseph finished. Maybe some of you don't remember that I had even started a series on Joseph. When I told Deb Stout that I was titling my message for today, Joseph Part 3, she said, "You already did a Part 1 and Part 2?" So I looked back to see when those were delivered, and it was March and June of 2023. So it's been a while, and you're all excused if you don't remember them. Anyway, I remember about being excited about preparing the third installment immediately after I presented the Joseph 2 message. On the Monday following that message, I sat down and put some ideas on paper and even wrote the first page and a half, and then I promptly stopped. So there it sat for over a year and a half on my computer, but since that time, a couple of people have actually asked me when I was going to do another message on Joseph. Well, here it is. Considering how long it's been since I have spoken on Joseph, I have been informed that a little bit of review from those first two messages would be helpful. For starters, some of you, and probably those of you who are not in attendance for the first two messages in the series, might be saying, Joseph who? And that's a fair question. We go back to the book of Genesis, where we find a young man who is not overly popular with his brothers. While they are out tending the sheep, Joseph is at home with Dad, and presented with that fact, some might perceive Dad has been favoring Joseph a bit. That point may have been driven home even further when Dad gives Joseph a beautifully colored coat. You see, none of the other 11 boys got one. So what do you do when your brother seems to be favored over all the rest of the family? Well, when the first opportunity comes along, you sell him into slavery. That's what you do. And don't tell me you didn't think about that at times if you had siblings. Perhaps you didn't go that far, but Joseph's brothers did. And they had the temerity to tell Dad when they returned home that a wild animal had killed their brother. They even showed him the blood that they had planted on that beautiful coat of his. Oh yes, that coat. That coat that they certainly weren't going to allow Joseph to keep. And the coat that came back to haunt Joseph's father. Joseph was bought by some traveling Midianites on their way back to Egypt with the many items that they had traded for and or purchased on their many travels north through the lands where Joseph's family lived. It's likely Joseph wasn't the only man they were escorting on this journey. They were all being taken back to Egypt to be sold. Joseph persevered through this trial as he decided to make the best of his tribulation. God honored Joseph during this time, and when he was eventually sold, the buyer turned out to be a noble named Potiphar. Joseph flourished even amidst this time of slavery, rising to the head of his noble's household. But ultimately, during this time period, he also attracted the wandering eyes of Potiphar's wife, and things were to go south once again for Joseph. End of short review, and on to today's story. "Who did they bring in today?" the guard asked the jailer. "A young guy," the jailer said. "They tell me they arrested him for trying to take advantage of Potiphar's wife." "You're kidding," the guard said. "Potiphar's wife? I can't believe they didn't kill him on the spot." "I know," the jailer said. "I hear the young man had it pretty good, too. They say he was promoted to Potiphar's head household steward or some position like that. Yet for some reason, Potiphar didn't have him put to death on the spot for what he did. Sure is a mystery to me. He told me to throw the guy in here with the rest of them." The guard said, "Some slaves don't know when they have it made in the shade. Well, he'll learn it here." "I know," the jailer replied. "They all learn it here." Meanwhile, it was finally quiet at Potiphar's house that evening as a couple of the field servants were turning in for the night. "You heard about what happened to Joseph last night, didn't you?" the one asked. "Only some rumors," the other said. "Do you have any idea what actually happened?" "I'm not sure. It doesn't seem like anyone really saw it. All I heard is that Joseph was seen running out of the house, and Potiphar's wife came running out after him, waving a coat and screaming about something. You can guess what was going on in there. But whatever actually happened, Potiphar was really ticked off. I didn't quite hear what he was saying to the guards when they left to find Joseph. But when he noticed I was watching all of this, he yelled at me to get back to work. That's pretty much all I know. But you know what? Even though we all know Joseph was Potiphar's pet, I'm going to miss him. It's been pretty nice around here since he came." "I know," said the other slave. When we last talked about Joseph 16 months ago, he had been taken to the jail where the king's prisoners were confined. But we did not have time to look at exactly what happened to bring this new trial in his direction. We have previously examined his trip to Egypt and his sale to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. We also saw that even though Joseph was now a slave, the positive attitude Joseph continued to display through his misfortunes brought God's blessings upon him. Things generally seemed to be going well, despite new and unfortunate situations that cropped up from time to time. These blessings from God not only affected Joseph, but they reverberated throughout the entirety of Potiphar's household. Well, almost all of Potiphar's household felt these blessings. It seems that for some reason, Potiphar's wife was not quite as happy as everyone else. And it's within this predicament that we'll rejoin Joseph's story this morning. We'll call this message Joseph Part 3. How's that for originality? I pick up now in Genesis chapter 39. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph. And she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do this great evil and sin against God?" As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were there inside. she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See what he has brought in, a Hebrew, to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside." So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to make sport of me, and I raised my voice and screamed. He left his garment beside me and fled outside." Do you ever get nervous when things are going too well? I suppose that in Joseph's case, too well might be an overstatement, but given his circumstances, things were going at least as well as could be expected. And then the shoe dropped. What caused Potiphar's wife to place all this unwanted attention on Joseph? Sin will creep in like that. And while we can't be positive about Mrs. Potiphar's motives, we do know what Joseph's reaction needed to be. Yet he was now caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Caught between a rock and a hard place. What does that really mean? Now, all good messages should get caught in the weeds at least once, so we'll ramble off the path here for a few seconds. To be caught between a rock and a hard place is an expression meaning to have to choose between two difficult options. So where did that phrase come from, you may wonder? The origin of the idiom between a rock and a hard place can be found in ancient Greek mythology. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus must pass between Charybdis, a treacherous whirlpool, and Scylla, a horrid man-eating cliff-dwelling monster. Ever since then, saying one is stuck between a rock, the cliff-dwelling monster, and a hard place, the whirlpool, has been a way to succinctly describe being in a dilemma. That interesting fact comes to us from the Ginger software website, whose veracity I cannot attest to. So take it as you wish. So Joseph is caught, in a tough spot. And I guess Potiphar is caught in a tough spot too. His most trusted servant is found to be in an extremely delicate situation. Could Joseph have done this most horrible thing? Could he tell Potiphar what a terrible lie his wife is telling? It would seem that this love Mrs. Potiphar supposedly had for Joseph had now turned to hate when Joseph spurned her advances. She even used Joseph's coat as a false witness. Joseph would not have known this, but this was the second time a coat that he had worn was being used as a false witness. His father still had Joseph's coat of many colors as a witness to Joseph's untimely death. Potiphar's wife couldn't even speak Joseph's name when she told her husband of what she was accusing him, saying, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us did this thing," as if slightly dehumanizing Joseph would soothe her shattered pride. Joseph had to know that an accusation like this could lead to a death sentence. Back to verse 19. Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," his anger burned. Did Joseph try to vindicate himself before Potiphar? Was Potiphar so enraged by this incident that he would not even listen to Joseph? Sad to say, we don't really know. What would it say to his wife and to anyone else who knew of this event if Potiphar let Joseph off the hook scot-free? It would seem that Joseph may have remained silent before Potiphar, a foreshadowing of an event many years still in the future. Jesus standing silent before Pilate and his accusers during his trial in Jerusalem, as we read in Matthew 27. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. Sometimes, excuse me, unfair as it may seem, there's a price to be paid for resisting temptation. Even though it can be extremely hard, we do this in faith, trusting God to work all things together for good, for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. From Romans 8. Verse 20. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the jail. Surprisingly, Joseph was spared the death sentence. Perhaps Potiphar knew more about the makeup of his wife than this story tells. But he also knew what Joseph was like. His anger may have come more because he sensed that his wife's accusations were not true. What may have been worse was that poor Potiphar was now going to be without Joseph, who had made his whole household run so smoothly, but he would still be stuck with his wife. Joseph's time in Potiphar's home was now over, but his life was spared. Now it was off to prison. Poor Joseph. He went from privilege in his father's house to the pit his brothers threw him into, to being property and sold in the slave market, to the privilege of managing Potiphar's household, to his principled stand against temptation, to the perjury of false accusation, and now to the prison of Pharaoh. We often look for ties to Christ in our Old Testament stories, and we certainly can find them in the story of Joseph. In addition to his aforementioned silence before his persecutors, we see the injustices that Joseph suffered for someone else's sin. But the story is far from over. As Charles Spurgeon writes, Joseph felt it a cruel thing to be under such a slander and to suffer for his innocence. A young man, so pure, so chaste, must have felt it sharper than a whip of scorpions to be accused as he was. Yet, as he sat down in the gloom of his cell, the Lord was still with him. I found this devotional in the upper room in August of 2023. When things go wrong, it can feel as if a heavy weight has fallen on our shoulders. In desperation to fix the problem, we turn to others for help. When we need to deal with paperwork, repair a car, or seek medical help, we know where to turn to get the assistance we need. But what happens when the person who is supposed to help us fails or doesn't have time? We may blame them for our problems, or maybe even blame God. When we seek the help of other people before we seek God's help, we lose sight of the central tenet of our faith. Christ is our salvation. We need to put all our hope in God because God is the ultimate source of our rescue. God knows every part of our lives, understands what we are going through, and is ready to move us toward the help we need. When we prioritize our relationship with God, we make room for God to act in our lives. When Christ is first in our lives, we can sense God's presence in every situation. Now we return to our story. Well, young man, what did they throw you in here for? A haggard old man asked Joseph inside the prison. At this point, I can only guess, Joseph replied. But I'm sure to find out from Potiphar before too long. Both of these men were in the king's prison. It's a place where Potiphar could quietly manage this ugly bit of business. I read in one commentary that Potiphar was captain of the guard, or as the title literally runs, chief of the executioners. In that capacity, Potiphar had charge of the prison which was connected with his house. It is therefore quite intelligible that he should have put Joseph in confinement on his own authority. And the distinction drawn between such a prisoner and the king's prisoners, who were there by royal warrant or due process of law, is natural. But even in that case, it was the mercy of the faithful covenant God, which now, as before, rescued Joseph's life. Back to our scripture text in verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. As we can see, none of the circumstances that befell Joseph could alter God's plans for him. In actuality, albeit in a way Joseph would never have chosen for himself, these trials were preparing Joseph for God's future plans for him. God blessed Joseph in the pit. He blessed him as a slave, and now he would bless him in the prison. Are our circumstances any bleaker than Joseph's, that God might not be blessing us in the midst of them? Can we allow ourselves to see through our trials to the greater good that God can bring about? As happened before in Potiphar's house, Joseph again rose to the top, becoming the chief administrator of the prison. Through his experiences in both places, God was sharpening the administrative skills Joseph would need one day to save his family and to ultimately save the whole world. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That story is for Joseph part 12 or 13. And Jeff thought traveling down the Roman road was a long series. But I digress. Let's get back to part 3. Joseph still had a lot to learn, and he would be better equipped to accomplish all that God had in store for him if he would accept his new circumstances. Again, as Spurgeon writes, the Lord was with Joseph, nonetheless, when he was cast into the prison. He knew God was with him in the prison, and therefore he did not sit down sullenly in his sorrow, but he bestirred himself to make the best of his afflicted condition. We move into chapter 40, finally. Joseph has had some time to get his feet under him in the prison, and now we see him befriending 2 new prisoners. Chapter 40, verse 1. Then it came about after these things, the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was furious with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the jail, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. The captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. Then it came about, sometime later, it came to pass. These are 3 of the different phrases used to open chapter 40, each phrase coming from a different version of the Bible. It's not particularly important to our story, but how long is sometime later? As I was listening to Pastor Chris's message on Genesis 40, and if you don't know Pastor Chris, check with Brenda or Patty Chrisman, his research tells him that Joseph would have been about 38 to 40 years old by this time. Given he was about 17 when he was bought by the Midianites in the wilderness, he is now about 21 to 23 years older. I couldn't find any other thoughts on this time span, so we'll go with this one. Joseph's been in his different imprisonments for quite a while. We now read that the chief baker and the chief cupbearer have somehow offended Pharaoh. Given that the official responsibility of these men was to keep the Pharaoh's food safe, it's possible that a plot was uncovered to poison him and that these two men had been implicated. But possibly their offense could have been as insignificant as Pharaoh finding a fly in his soup. We aren't told. Whatever they did to anger Pharaoh may be immaterial, because it is more likely these men were sent to this prison because God wanted them to meet Joseph. As verse 4 reads, the captain of the guard put Joseph in charge of them. The captain of the guard happened to be Potiphar. The text also noted that Joseph took care of them. Though Joseph now had a position of high authority in the prison, he did not use it to make others serve him. He used his high position to serve others. And does that make you think of somebody else? Verse 5. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in jail, both had a dream the same night. Each man drew with his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and observed them, behold, they were dejected. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in his master's house, why are your faces so sad today? Then they said to him, we have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret it. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please. If you recall from Joseph part 1, Joseph had some experience with interpreting dreams. Back in Genesis chapter 39, we read of Joseph having several dreams, showing his siblings and later his parents bowing down before him. How true these dreams were will become evident much later in our story. But at the time of his interpretation of these dreams, they were wholly unpopular with his family and were partially responsible for the situation he was in now. Now, empathizing with the sadness these prisoners in his charge were manifesting and hoping to speak to their troubled souls, perhaps with a word from God himself, Joseph desired to hear their dreams. And when he said, do not interpretations belong to God? Perhaps he felt he could bring a little bit of the Father to these two men. On to dream number 1. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. And as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of the dream. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand, according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in your mind when it goes well with you. And please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. God again brought men of some standing into Joseph's life, this time in the prison. God also engineered the dreams that these men experienced, dreams that Joseph agreed to interpret when the baker and the cupbearer lamented that they no longer had anyone to do that for them. The first dream belonged to the cupbearer. Not only would Joseph's interpretation provide the cupbearer with good news about his dream and his forthcoming restoration before Pharaoh, but Joseph recognized an opportunity for the grateful cupbearer to plead his case before Pharaoh. So Joseph related his unfortunate circumstances to the cupbearer. Now it was on to dream 2, the chief bakers. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that he had interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream, and in my dream, behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket, there were some of all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh. And the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Then Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head from you, and you will hang on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh off of you." Ooh. Oh, but look, we're out of time for today. So I will now leave you hanging. Stay tuned for Joseph Part 4. Let's finish with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, all of our circumstances flow through your hands. We love the good times, but we struggle with the bad. When we are going through those rough times, especially the ones that we don't think we deserve, we can see a kindred spirit in Joseph. Help us to see the reasons that you have allowed those trials in our lives, and help us to find the good that may come from each of them. Amen.